the pattern of the past where we hired people on the strength of their performance as individual contributors. And so I think that pattern is continuing into the future. And so I think that's what we're seeing. We heavily weighted technical criteria over cultural criteria, but I think we hit an inflection point at some point in the recent past, and that's beginning to change. So this is really interesting to see these data, these responses coming in.
It sure is. So I'm going to go ahead and share those results. We've got 61% technical, 39% cultural. Pretty interesting data. So let's go to this next one and talk about the selection criteria. So what are the criteria that your organization uses for selection, for hiring, firing, and promotion? Go ahead and put that in the chat. Would love to see what you have to say.
Yeah, what are the criteria? What do you use for these decisions? We'd really love to see that. So go to your chat and throw that in. Because of course, when you make the decision, whether it's conscious or unconscious, you're using selection criteria and you're weighting those. And based on the criteria that you use and the weight that you give to each of those criteria, then you're going to make that decision. So we'd be interested in understanding, what criteria do you use in your organizations?
The chat seems to be disabled. We're going to try and get that going. Let's see here. We've got a couple people on production on the back end. Will you please enable the chat? For the meantime, go ahead and throw it in the Q&A, I suppose.
Yep.
Organizational values. However, these are also filtered through bias from hiring managers. Experience, performance evaluations, experience in industry, character,
yeah,
potential. It's interesting because a lot of these things are qualitative, right?
Yeah.
Fit in the organization, education, motivated, smart, humble people, requested salary, the right
skills,
mindset,
cultural fit. Okay.
Fascinating. So pay attention to these criteria that are coming in. Every organization is different, and you'll see already we've got about 30 different criteria that organizations use. Okay, interesting. Let's go to the next polling question. I'm going to pull this up for you. How much of an individual's professional effectiveness is attributable to cultural competence? Let's talk about that.
Fantastic question, Junior. Fantastic question. I can't wait to see the results on this one.
Me too.
Yeah, take a few seconds and think about this. And it's an overall question, right? And so it applies across the board, levels of responsibility, role, skill area, just across the board. What do you think? Yeah, really interesting distribution that's emerging here.
Very interesting. We're going to let this go for just a few more seconds. And if you're on another platform, please go ahead and enter a comment for your selection.
Junior, let me just make a point here. So why are we asking these questions? We're asking these questions because these are the three main decisions that organizations have to make with respect to human capital. Who do we bring into the organization? Who do we move out of the organization? And who do we move up in the organization? And how do we do that? How do we make those decisions? And what we have seen is that in the recent past, there has been an inflection point. Actually, we're living through the inflection point now as we think about technical competence versus cultural competence and how those two interplay and how we weight those in making these human capital decisions. So that's why we're asking these questions, because we feel from all of the input and the feedback and the conversations that we're having with everyone, we feel that we're living through an inflection point right now during the 2020s, which we would frame as the decade of culture. So we want to hear from you what's happening in your organizations.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'm going to share the results with you. So go ahead and take a look at this. Distribution is pretty interesting. We have 29% of the audience saying 70% of an individual's professional effectiveness is attributable to cultural competence. In second place, 60%, then 50, then 80. Then we move into the 30s, 40s, 20s. This is fascinating. Does this surprise you? Does this surprise you?
Well,
Does
you've
it
got
not surprise you?
by far the majority are above 50%, Junior.
Yeah.
So we're
Far and
tilting
away.
the scales toward the cultural side of things.
Yeah. I mean, quick math, look, 75 to 80% are above 50%.
Yeah. Pretty amazing.
So I would love to hear what you all think about this distribution in the chat. And this goes to part of the core logic of this entire discussion, which is that most of us are saying, 75% in the poll are saying that we evaluate primarily by technical competence. Yet we're also saying in the same breath that more of an individual's professional effectiveness is attributable to cultural competence than technical.
Right.
And so I want to point that out, that at a really fundamental level here, there's some dissonance between what we understand qualitatively and intuitively about cultural competence and what we're selecting for when we're making these crucial decisions of hiring and firing and promotion.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop sharing that poll, and we're going to talk about psychological safety. Tim, why would we talk about psychological safety in the context coming out of that poll, talking about hiring, firing, and promotion? What does this have to do with our topic today?
Well, psychological safety refers to a type of culture and a type and a pattern of behavior, a norm of behavior that you may well incorporate into these three categories of decision: hiring people, firing people, and promoting people. And so we're going to talk about incorporating psychological safety into these decision-making processes and how it's the foundation of great culture. That's why it matters so much.
So let's define psychological safety. What is psychological safety? It's a culture of rewarded vulnerability. If you want a bigger foundation or a deeper foundation on what we believe about psychological safety, you can hit the site. We just came out with the next version of the complete guide to psychological safety, and of course the book, if you haven't read that. But we're going to talk about psychological safety as the heart of a healthy culture, as an environment, a culture of rewarded vulnerability, as it pertains to these three things. You may have also seen a post from Tim on LinkedIn this week that kind of went crazy, that we're going to talk about a little bit later, about using the track record of psychological safety as a promotion criteria. But pretty fascinating thing here. So let's talk about cultural impact versus technical competence. And you can use cultural impact synonymously with cultural competence, the way that we've been talking about this. And in every organization, there's some ratio. As we've seen in the distribution in the polling question, some organizations tilt towards cultural competence and cultural impact, the cultural impact that the employee or the leader has in the organization, or technical competence. And some organizations skew very far toward technical competence, and it's pegged out over there. So much so that cultural impact is really not something that we're even looking at. And therein lies the danger for so many organizations. One of the things that we also have to understand when it comes to cultural competence is that your cultural impact will almost never be neutral. It will be positive or it will be negative. In any interaction, it's going to fall usually on either side of the line. Do you see this? Let us know in the chat if you agree with that. What are we evaluating? Is pretty fascinating.
Junior, can I just make a comment on this?
Please.
So I want, for all of you viewers and listeners today, I want you to think about how you do, for example, succession planning, right? Which is promotion. A lot of organizations use the traditional 9-box. So I want you to think about the traditional 9-box as an evaluation tool. So with the 9-box, you have potential, right, on the vertical axis, and you have performance on the horizontal axis. But it's still not telling you what performance is based on. So if performance is based on primarily technical competence, then cultural competence or cultural impact is not being factored into the equation. So the 9-box doesn't really tell you anything because it doesn't tell you what is driving your assessment of potential and performance. What's behind that? It still is not telling you what the criteria are and what the weighting of those criteria are. So it's a nice tool, but it's not getting to the root of the issue, which is what we're trying to address today. What are the selection criteria that you're using, and how are you weighting those? That's what we're trying to get to. So do you understand how the 9-box is not telling us any of that? You've got to go deeper to identify your decision-making criteria.
I like one of these comments in the chat, and Tim and I were talking about this yesterday. Katie says, I prefer to think about values fit rather than cultural fit. If we hire for culture fit, we risk creating an echo chamber of folks who think and behave just like us. So Tim, maybe we can dive into that for just a second and talk about cultural fit versus cultural competence.
So we make as you say, Junior, we make a crucial distinction between cultural competence and cultural fit. Cultural fit means, do I fit in, right? The implication is, do I fit in with the prevailing culture? That's not very important. What's really important is, do I have cultural competence, which means, can I contribute as a cultural architect to the culture that we want based on the values that we espouse? So cultural fit is a dangerous term. There's a real liability to it. But cultural competence, we think, is a better term, because cultural competence leads to cultural impact in the way that you want it, in terms of shaping the culture, having an impact on the culture, living and modeling the values that you embrace as an organization. So we have to be careful with that fit concept, right? Because then it does move into, as we just heard, talking about creating an echo chamber, creating the homogenization of thought, creating compliance, creating just the homogeneity, when what we really need is, we need diversity, we need lateral thinking, we need cross-functional thinking. And so we have to be careful with that word fit.
Yeah. We want to talk about 3 failure patterns that we see in the hiring process that many organizations fall victim to. And they're easy traps to fall into. There's a leader factor note that we have if the production team would go ahead and link to that across the platforms. I think that might be helpful for people. The charisma hire, the resume hire, and the buddy hire. Now we're shifting our selection criteria. So if we think about it
Yes.
that way, right?
Yes.
And sometimes it's not organizations holistically, but specific hiring managers or departments can fall into these types of traps, and organizations can have tendencies for these as well. Tim, tell us about the charisma hire.
Right. So the charisma hire. So this is a trap that sometimes we can fall into as we're trying to hire someone. Someone comes into the organization, applies for a position, and we are enamored. We're captured by their charm, their dash, their style, their charisma. And so what happens is we lose sight of the regular selection criteria that we use, and we kind of push those aside because we're intoxicated by the charisma, and that becomes the number one decision-making criterion that we use. And then we hire someone because we've been sucked in based on the magnetism of this person. Well, what happens when we make a charisma hire? Usually there's buyer's remorse pretty quickly. So I just want to point that out as a failure pattern when it comes to hiring. Have any of you made a charisma hire? I have. I made a charisma hire years ago, and I regretted it every day after that until we had to move that person out of the organization. And it was incredibly painful. This person had amazing, just magnetism, and I got sucked into it. And yet that person went on to create a very toxic culture for their department. So I regretted that every single day after I did it. And I vowed that I would never make that mistake again. I got sucked in.
Yeah.
And many of you have maybe made that mistake. So we have to be very, very careful in doing that.
Oh, it seems like you're not alone. If we look at the chat, it looks like many people have made that mistake, and it's an easy one to make.
Yep.
Charismatic people can draw you in. Next, we have the resume hire. This one's interesting and probably more pervasive than the charisma hire.
Yeah.
If you hire just based on the paper, you're not getting those other criteria as part of the evaluation. Many people can look phenomenal on paper, on the resume, but they lack that cultural competence. The resume hire is often reflective of high technical competence, and then the cultural competence in this case is an X factor. We don't know what we're going to get. It's an unknown variable. We bring them into the organization based on that reflection of technical skill, and we take a gamble, and we're not quite sure. And sometimes that works out okay. Sometimes it's slightly positive or slightly negative, and sometimes it's catastrophic. That's another failure pattern that we see.
That's so true, Junior.
We also see, go ahead.
I just want to say something else, though. The resume is a very poor tool for capturing cultural competence, right? Now, we can glean some of it, but it doesn't represent cultural competence very well. But even with the resume, sometimes it conceals the lack of technical competence, Junior.
Yeah.
I mean, to be quite honest, because we're talking about the resume shows credentials, it shows experiences, it shows positions, it shows accomplishments. But we really, in many cases, we don't know. We're making assumptions about the level of performance.
Yeah. There are a lot of good questions that we have in the chat. And let me get to a couple of these. Neville, what does the hiring process look like that enables these three types of mistake hires? One of the things that I'll point to is when you have single points of failure. That's one of the things that I see as an organizational pattern. If you have one person that's making the decision to put a certain candidate through a piece of the pipeline, you can fall victim to this because a certain person might be swayed a certain way by a certain personality, and you find yourself swayed by the charisma hire. They might have a personal relationship. You fall victim to the buddy hire, or you're just trying to move through as fast as possible. You're screening resumes. There's a really big load on the organization. And that pressure means that we're taking the quickest path, which means that we're going to go based on the paper and based on the facts. And that happens pretty frequently, especially when you're understaffed or undersourced when it comes to the hiring.
Yeah.
Great questions. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next section, which is firing. This one is a very interesting one. And when we're talking about firing, we're talking about firing. We're not talking about layoffs and reductions in force. There's been a lot of upheaval recently. And so we want to make that very clear that we're talking about managing people out of the organization deliberately because of some of these reasons that have to do with cultural competence. So let's talk about stage one inclusion safety as kind of an introduction to this piece of today's webinar. Tim, what's inclusion safety?
So inclusion safety is the first stage of psychological safety. It's the foundation stage, and it means that a person feels included and accepted and has a sense of belonging. So there's this sense of community and connection to the team, to the organization. That's stage one, inclusion safety.
The reason we want to use that as the introduction is because many of the infractions when it comes to cultural competence, and we'll talk about that, have to do with this, with stage one. Stage one is built on a foundation of respect. That's the fundamental piece at the very bottom, is respect for the person in front of you. And if that doesn't exist, then you will have problems down the line. And it'll be very difficult to move to those subsequent stages. So when we talk about firing, we're talking about people who are constantly breaching this, a boundary of respect. So if we go back to the definition of psychological safety, which is a culture of rewarded vulnerability, then what would the opposite be? What would a lack of psychological safety look like? We define this as a culture of punished vulnerability. Wherever you have consistency around the punishing of vulnerability, you have what we call a red zone, or an area of low psychological safety. And what we find in organizations when it comes to this topic is they are not managing people out of the organization that are constantly or consistently or predictably or have a pattern of crossing this line. Would you say that that's true, Tim?
Yeah, I would. And so that takes us to a fundamental distinction with respect to the issue of accountability. There are two types of accountability. There's performance accountability, which is traditional accountability based on your performance metrics and the outcome, right? The outcome measures that you need in your organization. That's traditional performance accountability. We all know how to do that pretty well, and we measure it pretty well. So we can take a look at the outcomes and we can see how things are going. But the other category of accountability is cultural accountability. So performance accountability focuses on the results, but cultural accountability focuses on how we get those results. Most organizations, at least traditionally, have not been very good at holding people culturally accountable. And so think about the distinction: performance accountability, cultural accountability. How well does your organization do? And as Junior said, when people commit infractions of inclusion safety, right? That's the most common form of not demonstrating cultural accountability as a member of a team or as a leader in some capacity. This is where we find most of the violations with stage one inclusion safety.
So let's talk about organizations not letting leaders go that probably should be let go. And the point here is that if cultural competence is not a criteria for evaluation, then it's not part of the equation. And the only way that the person would leave the organization is if the technical competence or the performance was not there. And so that's a very key point. When we go back to the criteria of evaluation, that needs to be part of it. Because if it's not there, then there's really no mechanism by which we can decide that they should not be part of the organization.
Junior, let me make a comment here, though. A lot of people would say to you, oh, but it is there. We do take into account cultural accountability. But the fact is that it's haphazard, it's ad hoc, it's anecdotal, it's impressionistic, and we are not systematically evaluating the cultural performance and the cultural competency of the individual. That's what's happening. We're just, again, we're taking an ad hoc and a haphazard approach. And as we move further into the decade of the 2020s, we're seeing that that's not working. It's inadequate. We've got to be more systematic of not only of holding people culturally accountable, but making these decisions and using cultural competence as a selection criterion that we are very consistent in applying.
Yeah. One of the points that I think is worth mentioning as a pattern that we've seen in healthy organizations is that there is some consistency, a pattern around people that are being managed out of the organization that are not culturally competent. There will be casualties along the way as you run your organization. And if there is not a trail of people that occasionally are moved out because of cultural reasons, then you can be quite sure that there's a problem. So it's actually one of the most interesting indicators that we can see about the health of an organizational culture is whether or not people are being managed out based on that cultural competence criteria.
Junior, let me make a comment based on this statement that Floria put into the chat, which I think is critical.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, we witnessed what many people call the Great Resignation. Millions of people walked away from their jobs. That fact demonstrates what? Among other things, it helps us understand that millions of people are willing to walk away from their jobs, even when they are in difficult economic circumstances. They're walking away. Now, if you look at the data, kind of the exit interview data from the Great Resignation, what did we learn? Most of it was about living in a culture and working in a culture of punished vulnerability. That's why they walked away. So the Great Resignation is a massive wake-up call for all organizations to understand that they need to be doing cultural accountability. And that we haven't been doing it adequately because all of these people are walking away. They were willing to walk away based on cultural factors. That's the primary reason that people walked away.
I appreciate that comment. And to address another comment in the chat, we absolutely want to give people an opportunity to reform. But that's been an interesting part of some of our research and observation is that there's this spectrum of toxicity, and it could be very, very mild. You just barely crossed your toe over that boundary of respect. You're not automatically leaving the organization. It's coached, as many other things are coached. If you get so far pegged out on that spectrum of toxicity where you're actively toxic, and you're complicit in the toxicity, if you're someone who's associated with it, the chances for reformation go down significantly. That's the pattern that we've seen, isn't it, Tim?
Yeah, it is. So you have to distinguish between two types of leader. If they are creating a toxic environment, as Junior said, they can be actively toxic, which means that they are actively engaging in toxic behavior, or they can be passively complicit. That's a very different thing. To be passively complicit means that you're allowing other people on the team to engage in toxic behaviors without consequence. Why does that distinction matter? Because the actively toxic boss only has about a 5% chance that they'll be coachable enough to fix the problem. So they typically need to be moved out of at least the team and maybe out of the organization. But the passively complicit bosses are almost always coachable. So that's a very different thing. So if the coachability is there, a lot of times they don't know how to maintain accountability. They don't know how to create the culture on the team. They need help. So do you see the difference in the motivational profile and the behavioral patterns of these two camps of leaders? They're very, very different. The root cause is different. Therefore, the corrective action has to be different, one versus the other.
Agreed. So to tie this back into the premise, we're talking about three things: hiring, firing, and promotion. We're not just talking about hiring. We're not just talking about firing, and we're not just talking about promotion. Those three things need to be in line, and we need to evaluate the same set of criteria across all three. Because what happens is if we just focus on the front end in hiring, first of all, we have to deal with the legacy culture of which we're a part. There's a culture that exists already, and the likelihood that it's perfectly healthy is zero. And so if you just focus on that front end, you're going to be missing the majority of the pie that already exists. That's why we need this mechanism on the back end to get the wrong people out of the organization or out of the roles that they should not be in. So we got to get the right people in to the right positions that are demonstrating the cultural competence that we want to embody as an organization. Those that can't hold that line need to leave the organization if they're repeatedly punishing vulnerability and crossing that boundary of respect. And now we move into promotion, which is we need to get the right people at the right levels of the organization that demonstrate cultural competence. And this can be one of the most dangerous and pernicious that exists, is if we get this last mechanism wrong. Tim, anything you want to say on the firing front before we move into promotion?
Well, you said it earlier, there will be casualties. Organizations, though, are beginning to understand the importance of consistently holding people culturally accountable. And Junior, this is something that we talked about just the other day. What you tolerate becomes the norm. When it comes to cultural accountability, what you tolerate becomes the norm. This is a very important principle. And so you can't make exceptions here and there based on cultural accountability, because everything falls apart. So just think about that. Even if it's once in a while, what you tolerate becomes the norm. That's just the one thing that I would like to emphasize.
I appreciate you calling that out. You get what you tolerate. And one of the conversations we were having earlier in the week on the podcast actually was that there's this element of tolerance longitudinally. If you tolerate something one time, it's very different than tolerating it over a long time. The requirements need to stay the same and be consistent over time. Because if there's this big squeeze on the hiring front or the firing front, and we try to get these things right, but then we slowly start to tolerate what was the norm previously, we will regress. It's very important that when we impose these types of norms, that we hold them over time so that we can give the organization enough time to adopt and then sustain. And the other thing that I really liked about our conversation was the idea of peer-based accountability. So right now, we're really talking about this formal criteria that you're evaluating during the hiring phase and during evaluations for firing and promotion. And it's somewhat top down in that we want to bring people into the organization. We're formally evaluating. But once that norm becomes adopted and perpetuated through the organization, the accountability line looks different. It becomes less vertical and more horizontal, where the majority of the team now will not tolerate certain types of behavior, and it becomes peer-based. That's when organizations really start to move the needle and win over a long period of time, is when it's not just the top down saying, hey, that's not acceptable. Rather, the peer base saying, hey, that's not how we do things here. That's not tolerated.
And that's when you really consolidate the culture, Junior.
Yeah. Okay. For those of you more interested in that particular topic, there's a webinar that we've done in the past, how to fix a toxic culture. We can link that for you. Really good one if you want to dive a little bit deeper on that topic. So let's get into promotion. This one, we're going to kick off with a polling question. So if you're in Zoom, I'm going to go ahead and kick this off. If you're on another platform, go ahead and leave a comment. Give me just a second to get this thing up and running. Tim, can you read that for us?
Yeah. So the polling question is, does your organization rely heavily on cultural competence data as part of its promotion criteria? Does your organization rely heavily on cultural competence data as part of its promotion criteria? Yes or no?
I'm going to let this run for just a little while. The distribution here, we really were curious about. We wanted to see. With some of these questions, we have some hunches, but really interested to see what the data bears out.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead. Last 5 seconds. Go ahead and get your response in there, and I'll close up this poll. Okay. So I'm going to end that poll, and I'm going to share the results with you. We have 21% saying yes and 79% saying no. So about 80% of us are saying that our organizations do not rely heavily on cultural competence data as part of its promotion criteria.
So, Junior, that confirms our hypothesis that the way that we approach it is ad hoc and it's haphazard. And that's the pattern that we've brought from the past. That's really the pattern since the Industrial Revolution, is that we overweight technical competence, we underweight cultural competence, and we make these vital human capital decisions. And what we're saying is we've reached a critical inflection point, and going forward, that's not going to work. We're not going to be able to sustain the level of the level of failure that we've had in the past, because the people are just too willing to walk away. So you think about what's at risk: the engagement, the productivity, the retention of people. So that's why we asked this question.
Yeah. We're getting a lot of comments in the chat, questions about how do you gather this data? It's a good question, and a question that we've been trying to answer for a long time. And it's a big reason that we created the 4 Stages team survey. We're going to give each of you an opportunity at the end to go to the site and request a free team survey. But we actually measure this. So I'm going to skip ahead and just show you this. This is an organizational chart view of some of the outcomes. This is not in great detail, but just to give you an idea of how this works and how we look at promotion inside organizations. Is at the team level, we measure psychological safety. That level of psychological safety is a direct reflection of the cultural competence of the leader that leads that particular team. And so as you look to fill pieces in the organization and backfill a position that's left, promote, you can look at this type of data. So as an example, if we're looking, let's say Marjorie moves to a different spot in the organization, and these are Marjorie's direct reports, the ones that are in line for this role, we can very quickly see that there are some red flags around some of the data that is a mirror for the cultural competence of that particular leader. And we can see that we might have some stronger applicants based on what their team's saying about their culture and whether vulnerability is being punished or rewarded. So we're not going to go too much into the team survey. It's not a sales pitch, but this is how we do it inside organizations: is we measure psychological safety and then use that data to inform the decisions.
So, Junior, let me just see if I can summarize for viewers. So, psychological safety, which is a measure of the pattern of whether vulnerability is being rewarded or punished, that measure becomes a proxy for cultural competence. So regardless of what other attributes you may want in your culture, what we're saying is that the core of the culture the core norm of the culture needs to be one of rewarded vulnerability. We can measure that very accurately. And that provides a reflection of how the microculture of that team is doing.
So let's talk about this quote. This is an interesting quote. We, Tim, you published this on LinkedIn this week.
Yeah, it got a little bit of little reaction, didn't it? It either struck a chord or tapped a nerve. I can't figure out which one it was. Maybe it was a little of both.
I think it was a little of both, or a lot of both.
Yeah.
It was really fascinating to read the threads and the comments about this. Employees who do not have a demonstrated track record of creating psychological safety should not be eligible for promotion to management. Well, maybe unpack this for us, Tim. Why would
sure?
you
And I don't mean. Let me qualify this a little bit. I don't mean to sound harsh or curt or unfeeling or to lack sensitivity at all when I make this statement. But yet I do make this statement and I stand by it, because if you're in a managerial role, by definition, your stewardship is to contribute indirectly through other human beings. That's your job. And if you don't have a threshold level of competence in being able to create psychological safety, which is the primary enabling skill for contributing through other people, then you should not be managing humans. And I don't mean that, as I said, I don't mean that disrespectfully, but that's the core competency of what the job requires. And so let's work on that before we give you a managerial role. We can't thrust you into a managerial role if you have no track record of being able to nurture and foster psychological safety. That doesn't make sense. So if someone's struggling, then okay, let's work with that person, but let's not drop them into a management role. The stakes are too high and the margin of error is too low. We're talking about managing human beings. This in large measure accounts for the Great Resignation. People said, I can't, I have a manager that doesn't know how to manage people. So psychological safety is the truest measure of cultural competence. So there's a little bit of explanation for the statement.
It's hard to put all of that explanation in a LinkedIn post.
It is. It is.
But it's fascinating to see people's comments in the chat. We would love to hear what you all think about this statement, if you agree with it. It seems like we've got quite some overwhelming agreement in the chat. If you're in another platform, please leave us a comment. We'd be interested in how you feel about this statement. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 stages resources as we wrap up today, some free things that we have for you, and then we'll get to the book giveaway. So we have published the most recent version of the complete guide to psychological safety. This is available for download on the website, which is a more comprehensive view of how Leader Factor looks at psychological safety, how we define it, and then how we break it down into the 4 stages. So that will be linked in the chat, and leaderfactor.com/resources is a great place to go to get all of these things. But if the production team would link some of these in the chat, that would be fantastic. We've got the historical Leader Factor webinar, several dozen of those that you can find on YouTube and on the website. The 4 stages book, if you haven't had a chance to read that, of course, we would highly recommend. And then Culture by Design. This is something that I would like to spend just a second on. This is something that we started not too long ago. We are about, I don't want to get the number wrong, but several dozen episodes in, and it has been an absolute fun ride. If you've had a chance to listen to the podcast, we would love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't, we would love to have you check it out. We recently finished a 4-part series on the 4 stages of psychological safety. So if the model is new to you, would highly recommend that as an entry point. That's probably 4 to 5 hours of content about each of the 4 stages. That's been a really, really fun podcast, and we've had some wonderful guests. Tim, how's your experience been with the podcast?
Well, I've really loved being a part of it, and it allows us to go into more depth to treat some of these concepts that are so important. And so it's just a great forum for doing that. And I think there's a lot of value there.
Fantastic. Okay. Request a free team survey. If the question, how do you measure cultural competence, is an interesting question to you and you would like to know the answer, please reach out to us. We would love to share our thoughts on how we measure psychological safety, the survey mechanics, all of our proprietary instrument, the validated items, and share with you how we do this. This has made a huge difference in the organizations that we work with. You can look at some of the clients that we work with on our website, leaderfactor.com. But there will be a form available to you on the website. We will link to that as well, where you can fill this out and request a free team survey to measure the psychological safety team or on a team inside your organization that you might be managing or be a part of. Okay, so the production team has given me a name. It looks like Vanessa Page will be the giveaway winner of the signed copy of the 4 stages of psychological safety. Vanessa, looks like you're still in the chat. There you go. Thank you for attending, Vanessa. We are happy to be able to send this to you. So our production team is going to reach out to you, get your details, and make sure that that gets into your hands. So to sign off, we want to say thank you. Thank you for your attention today. We appreciate your involvement, your time. We know that you could be spending your time doing a million different things. So thank you for spending a little bit of it with us today. And thank you for the good that you do in the world. It's something that's very important to us. This topic is near and dear to our hearts. And our mission is to help organizations and leaders all around the world improve their cultures, improve their lives, improve their experiences. If we do that, we'll have a much better place to live, a much better world to live in. The world desperately needs it, as we have all seen. So thank you for all that you do. We appreciate you and your efforts, and we are here to help. If you have any questions about anything that we've talked about today, don't hesitate to reach out to our team. Our team is ready, willing, and able to help you. So thank you. Tim?
Yeah, thanks very much. And just remember that we're all cultural architects in this journey together. So thanks for spending an hour with us.
Yep. And Alana, are we all hiring? We are hiring. So that's something that you can check out on our website as well. We're hiring in several different functions, trying to grow the team to impact more people. All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care.